After Kristen French disappeared in the spring of '92, the Niagara Region Police created the Green Ribbon Task Force, named after the green ribbons worn by local residents in support of the search for the victims. Thus began one of the largest police operations in Canadian history. Law enforcement officers collected eyewitness accounts of Kristen's abduction, descriptions of the car, and the suspected couple. At the same time, another Toronto police unit was investigating a series of muggings by a Scarborough Rapist. To save him half an hour, no one initially linked the cases, but eventually they were to come together. Want a joke? In November 1990, when the police were looking for the Scarborough Rapist, Bernardo was called in for questioning. His appearance was like a photo robot, and several people pointed to him as a non-suspect. Then Paul calmly gave a statement and voluntarily provided a sample of his DNA for analysis. And the funny thing is that this DNA sample was never processed until 1992. Well, because of the workload of the laboratory, this DNA sample lay untested for more than 2 years. Nevertheless, on February 1, 1993, experts informed the police that Bernardo's DNA matched the biological traces of the Scarborough Rapist. This was a decisive breakthrough in the case. Having received evidence of Bernardo's involvement in the sexual assaults, the police began to monitor him. At that time, Paul and Karla were still living together in St. Catharines. It is worth noting that at the end of 1992, their relationship, despite their common hobby, was not so strong. Paul beat Karla. In December 1992, he beat her with a flashlight so badly that she ended up in the hospital. There's even a photo. She was scolding the doctors. She made up a story about a car accident to explain the injuries, but her parents understood that there was no accident, so they took their daughter into their home. Karla was preparing for a divorce. The police investigation team decided that the couple's quarrel was the perfect moment to invite Karla for questioning, without revealing all the suspicions, but hinting that they knew about Paul's involvement in a series of attacks on women. And do you know what she did? She hired a lawyer, despite the fact that she was not suspected of anything.
He didn't turn the water tap off completely. He hit me. If he held knives to my throat, he told me I better watch my back. He said always watch your back with me.
Karla agreed to cooperate with the investigation, but not just like that. She set a clear condition: complete immunity from prosecution, no charges, no trial, nothing. And then negotiations began between her lawyer and the prosecutor's office. At that time, the prosecutors did not yet know that there were videos that the monsters had not shot, God forbid. At that time, they had not yet seen how this poor woman, the victim of a sadist, participated in the abuse and did not hide her pleasure. And that's why they decided to agree. In their eyes, she was a key witness against Paul, the only chance to get a complete picture of the crimes. Yes, Karla got what would later be called a deal with the devil. On February 17, 1993, Paul Bernardo was finally arrested in his home. At that time, there was already serious evidence against him in the conspiracy cases, but there was not enough evidence to charge him with the murders of Leslie and Kristen. The police searched the couple's home and seized a lot of physical evidence, including written materials, photographs, and receipts for the purchase of bags of cement. However, the video recordings that I keep mentioning have not yet been found. As it turns out later, Paul hid the cassettes in a ceiling lamp. We will come back to this later. Meanwhile, the prosecution was faced with a dilemma. There was already enough evidence against Karla to charge her with the murders, as it became clear that she was an accomplice. But the main goal was to convict Bernardo as the direct killer, and without Karla's testimony, the chances of getting a conviction for the murders were slim at that time. The authorities weighed all the pros and cons and took the difficult step. In exchange for full and truthful testimony against her husband, Karla was offered a plea deal. She agrees to a limited charge of involuntary manslaughter of the two girls and, mind you, will receive only 12 years in prison. Karla accepted the terms. In June 1993, Karla Homolka pleaded guilty in a closed-door trial to 2 counts of involuntary manslaughter of Leslie McAfee and Kristen French and was sentenced to 12 years in prison. She gave investigators a detailed account of her story, portraying herself as a victim of domestic violence who had been pressured by her monster husband. At the time, the testimony was not yet public. The judge ordered a publication ban on the details, so as not to undermine Bernardo's right to a fair trial. However, you still had such information, and American journalists, who are not subject to this ban, calmly published Homolka's testimony in newspapers, which somehow leaked from the courtroom. For example, the newspaper The Buffalo News. The joke is that some Canadians still smuggled a few copies of newspapers from the states across the border, and then classic word of mouth did its job. The information got out, and for Paul, the situation began to smell bad, and now there will be a super unexpected turn. In September '94, Polo's lawyer suddenly withdrew from the case, and before that he handed over to the police what they could not find during the searches. The same videotapes. The guy just hid the tapes in the bathroom light fixture. Yes, not in a safe, not in a secret room, not in a hole under the floor, in a light fixture. And the police didn't find them. And that happens, imagine. Bernardo's first lawyer, Kenneth, at the behest of his client, found this evidence and hid it from the police for over 17 months. In the end, Paul's new defense attorney turned it over to the authorities and dropped the case. One can't help but draw a parallel with the movie The Devil's Advocate. To say that these videos shocked everyone who was in the court is an understatement. On the tapes, Karla and Paul personally filmed scenes of the rape of a girl named Jane Doe. Also Leslie and Kristen, and Karla's sister Tammy. These films showed that Tammy had been murdered, not killed by alcohol poisoning, so her body was exhumed on July 20, 1993. For further examination, the experts looked for any traces of anesthetic, chemical damage, or signs of external influence that could prove the violent nature of her death. Interestingly, after the exhumation, the parties removed the invitation to Karla and Paul's wedding. These monsters had planted it there on the day of the funeral. This invitation had their photo on it. Imagine how fucked up they are. Well, the video clearly showed that Karla was actively participating in the crimes and did not look like an intimidated victim. Moreover, the tapes recorded her committing the violence herself and enjoying the process. However, the agreement had already been made with the investigation and was not subject to review. Fast forward to now, Karla Homolka, the cold-blooded killer who filmed her crimes, is now at large. Yes, that's her in these shots, but we'll talk about that at the end of the video. Now let's look at why they did it. Let's analyze the psychological portraits of monsters. Let's start with Paul Bernardo. This creature was born on August 27, 1964 in the city of Scarborough. In, at first glance, a normal family. In fact, the atmosphere was not okay. For example, Paul's father was convicted of pedophilia and corruption. Corruption of his own daughter. He did it without hiding it, sometimes in front of the whole family. And his mother suffered from depression and actually retired, living in the basement of the house. Apparently, these factors put a lot of pressure on the field. Nevertheless, at school and university he seemed cheerful, polite, was the soul of the company. Friends and acquaintances considered him charismatic and attractive. A kind of seducer, he was also fond of pickup trucks. By 1990, Bernardo had lost his job as an accountant and was smuggling cigarettes across the nearby Canada-US border, using left-hand license plates on his cars. Psychologists who examined Bernardo after his arrest concluded that he was a diagnosed psychopath and sexual sadist. Paul had a pathological need to dominate, control, and humiliate his victims. He enjoyed it. He planned his crimes and even wrote down his fantasies. He was also crazy about BDSM porn and wanted to put it all into practice, but in a more brutal way. At the same time, he knew how to be outwardly kind and polite, which helped him to disguise himself in society. Although it wasn't the real him, it's just a mask, if that doesn't sound pathetic. In short, the guy is a psychopath, literally diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. For reference, Paul Bernardo scored 35 and 40 on the psychopathy test. This is almost the maximum that is officially classified as clinical psychopathy. Karla, for comparison, scored only 5 points, and somehow these two came together. Karla Homolka, on the contrary, had a completely normal childhood. This piece of crap was born on May 4, 1970 in Ontario. She was the eldest of 3 sisters in the family. She studied at the top of her class in school, adored animals. Her first job was a pet store. She dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. By the way, it was while working at the pet store that she met that girl called Jane Doe. At the age of 17, at a veterinary conference, she met 23-year-old Paul Bernardo. Paul immediately liked Karla, handsome, confident, witty. They felt a mutual attraction, an important nuance. Very quickly, Karla showed a willingness to obey Paul in everything. They were connected by a relationship in the style of dominance and submission, where Bernardo demanded complete control, and Karla, in love and dependence, agreed to fulfill even his darkest desires. As you already know, psychologists suggested that Karla had narcissistic and psychopathic traits. This was evidenced by the cold-bloodedness with which she helped to call her own sister, and then participated in the torture of other girls. After her arrest, she was examined by psychiatrists, and some experts tried to explain her behavior by the so-called abuser submission syndrome. Remark is not a clinical diagnosis, but an informal term describing a condition where a victim of prolonged violence is aware of what is happening, but submits to the perpetrator out of fear, addiction, or a complete loss of control. Not to be confused with Stockholm Syndrome. There, on the contrary, the victim believes that the aggressor is actually good. During investigative experiments, interrogations, and at the trial, she behaved like a victim of domestic violence. But the crimes recorded on video showed another side. Karla dominated her victims, laughed at herself, and cruelly mocked them. This gave rise to discussions about who she really was, intimidated accomplice or the same monster as her husband. The Canadian press gave her the nicknames a modern-day Lady Macbeth and the Witch from Ontario, hinting that she could cunningly manipulate the image of the victim. Be that as it may, the psychological portrait of Karla Homolka is one of the most controversial aspects of this case. Write your opinion in the comments. The trial of Paul Bernardo became one of the most high-profile in the 90s. In 1995, after 2 years of preparation and evidence collection, due to excessive publicity of the case, the court was moved to Toronto and strict security measures were taken. He was charged with a number of counts: 2 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, false imprisonment, aggravated sexual assault, and indecent assault. He pleaded not guilty to the murders, claiming that the deaths of Leslie and Kristen were accidental or due to Karla. The main trump card of the prosecution was those disgusting videos found in Bernardo's house. The jury had to watch the tapes, which documented the abuse of the victims. Well, the key witness, as you know, was Karla Homolka, an already convicted accomplice. For several weeks, Karla testified in great detail. Bernardo's defense tried to tarnish her reputation, emphasize Karla's own cruelty, proving that it was she who could have initiated the murders. In short, the froggaduking began. In one of the letters from prison, Paul called Karla a born devil and claimed that he was no less afraid of her than she was of him. However, this line did not work at trial. Most of the evidence indicated the active participation of both, but Paul was the physical perpetrator of the murders. Homolka's testimony Medical examinations, physical evidence and videos formed a clear picture of the defendant's guilt. On September 1, 1995, the jury delivered its verdict. Paul Bernardo was found guilty on all major counts. He received the maximum possible sentence in Canada, life imprisonment without the right to apply for parole for 25 years. The court recognized him as a dangerous criminal. This status means that Paul will most likely never be released. What can you not say about Karla, who was already released on July 4, 2005? And already the prosecutor's office was criticized for this deal with the devil. At the same time, the prosecutors justified themselves by saying that without this deal, Bernardo could have avoided a fair punishment. In general, people were not very happy, and you can imagine the reaction of the families of the murdered girls. I'm kind of shocked that they didn't lynch her, to be honest. Personally, in my eyes, she's just as much a monster as Paul. Well, in short, Karla Homolka tried to change her name. She had already used the pseudonym Lintel during the investigation and trial, and after her release, she filed an official request to change her name to Emily Chiara Tremblay, choosing one of the most common surnames in Quebec. However, in 2006, the court rejected her request because her lawyer filed a late appeal. Despite this, she continued to use the name Lintel in everyday life. Later, she even got married. Imagine, the lucky one was her lawyer's brother. Homolka took the surname of Bordella's husband. They had 3 children. At the time of recording this video, Paul Bernardo is 60 years old. He's still rotting behind bars. Karla Homolka is now 55. She has been living at large somewhere in the suburbs of Montreal, Quebec, for 20 years. That's the story. Kids, thanks for watching. Take care.